Some hearts take longer to learn how to love, and others have simply forgotten how it's done. But what if true love doesn't come from a passionate kiss, but from a silent reading, an avoided touch, a dinner in silence? Not every romance starts with promises. Some begin with resistance, with high walls, cold glances, and a house where the wind is the only thing that circulates freely. But when Charlotte arrived at the Carter farm, it wasn't with force, it was with lightness. And that was what disarmed William the most. This story is for you who has loved someone who didn't know how to love back, or for you who still carries hope, even after so many doors have been closed. Prepare your heart, because today you're going to experience an intense transformation. Of two scarred souls, of a restrained touch, and a night that changed everything. Comment here where you're listening to this story from. I want to know how far this love will reach. And if this story already moved you just by the introduction, then subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and send this video to someone special. Because maybe this is also their story, or his, or hers, or yours. The hot Texas wind blew without asking, lifting small dust devils along the dirt road that led to the Carter ranch. Charlotte stepped down from the carriage with a slight tremor in her fingers, holding tightly to the handle of the small leather suitcase she carried. Her eyes scanned the scene ahead, a grand, dark wooden house, isolated amidst arid, golden fields. The afternoon sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows over the porch, where a male figure stood motionless, watching her. William Carter, a man with a rigid posture and eyes as grey as steel. Charlotte shivered, not from fear, but from something she couldn't yet name. She had read about looks like his in her novels, intense, unreadable, filled with untold stories. And there she was, coming from a distant orphanage, with dreams woven into the pages of old books, about to enter an arranged marriage orchestrated by the sister of the man who now looked at her as though she were just another task in his day. Without a word, William turned his back and walked into the house. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The scent of dry earth and wild lavender danced in the air. She adjusted the shawl over her shoulders and moved forward, stepping lightly yet decisively onto the wooden porch. The door creaked when she gently pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark, with heavy furniture, closed curtains, and a silence that seemed to have a life of its own. The sound of her footsteps echoing on the floor was the only response she received. William stood next to the cold fireplace, arms crossed, jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. "The room is the last one down the hall. To the right," he said, without looking directly at her. "Dinner is served at 6. I don't expect delays." Charlotte nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in her throat. She hadn't expected a bouquet of welcome, but she also wasn't prepared for such coldness. The carriage pulled away outside with the creak of the wheels and the sound of hooves fading, sealing her fate with the man who now disappeared through another door, like a shadow that didn't want to be followed. She slowly climbed the stairs, running her fingers over the carved wood of the railing, trying to imagine how many stories this house kept. When she entered the room, she found a clean space but lacking any warmth. No flowers, no pictures. Just a bed, a dresser, and an old chipped mirror. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. She had learned early on that the world didn't offer comfort easily, and that sometimes love, if it came after pain. She took off her hat, undid the braid in her hair, and almost instinctively opened her suitcase, pulling out one of her favorite novels. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the worn cover and smiling, as if reconnecting with an old friend. At that very moment, downstairs, William Carter lit a cigarette slowly, his eyes lost in the flames of the newly lit fireplace. He didn't understand why the presence of this unknown woman stirred something in him, but there was something in her brown eyes, the way she stepped down from the carriage, something that reminded him of what he'd spent his life trying to forget. And there, separated by a wooden ceiling and an abyss of unspoken emotions, began the story neither of them expected to live. But what Charlotte didn't know yet is that the coldest heart on the ranch had already started to melt, slowly, silently, the moment their eyes met on the porch. Charlotte came down for breakfast the next morning with her shoulders covered by a simple shawl, but with a serene face. She had slept little, kept awake by the winds rattling against the windows and the thick silence of the house. Even so, she made a point of keeping her steps light and her gaze dignified. She had learned early on that kindness was sometimes the only defense against the world. The kitchen still carried the faint scent of reheated coffee. William was already sitting at the table, reading a crumpled newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered. He simply motioned with a sharp gesture to the empty chair in front of him. The silence between them was as thick as fog. Not even the sound of the cups moving was enough to break it. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but firm. He turned a page in the newspaper as if he hadn't heard. After an awkward pause, he replied without emotion, "William, I'm not your boss. Not yet." Charlotte bit the inside of her cheek, surprised by the correction. In a way, he had acknowledged the bond that now connected them, even if just with the tips of his fingers. She poured herself some coffee, her hands steady despite the tension. Across the table, William watched her sideways, not raising his eyes, but she could feel it. That sense of being measured, evaluated, as if she were just another of the ranch's animals being inspected. "The house is very quiet," she commented, trying to break the barrier. William lifted his gaze for a second. "It was made for that. Peace is all I need." Charlotte wanted to ask if he considered her presence a disruption of that peace, but she held back. Instead, she took a small sip of her coffee and let the silence return. He had turned his eyes back to the newspaper, but wasn't reading. For some reason, her voice stuck in his mind. Soft, without exaggeration. Natural. It was as if every word that came from her mouth was cleaning a bit of the dust he had let accumulate in his heart. "My sister said you like lavender," he suddenly said. Charlotte blinked, surprised. "It's true, but how does she know?" "You wrote it in a letter," he murmured, still not looking at her directly. "You said you liked books, sewing, and lavender." Charlotte smiled tenderly. "I thought no one read those letters." William stood up abruptly. "Most people don't." He walked over to the stove and grabbed an empty mug, pretending to look for something. But in reality, he was escaping from her presence, from the soft scent of lavender that was already beginning to fill the rooms, from that uncomfortable feeling that if he stayed another minute near her, he might give in. Charlotte didn't insist on the conversation. Instead, she lifted her eyes and watched him in silence. The rigidity in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact, the awkward care with which he placed the mug on the counter. He wasn't cruel, he was wounded. Hand wounds, she knew, often screamed in silence. That first morning, no smiles were exchanged, no gestures of closeness were made. But there was something in the air, subtle, like the smell of coffee, like the rustling of the leaves outside the window. Something neither of them could name, but that was growing. An invisible thread, fragile but persistent, and it was on that thread that Charlotte decided to walk. The afternoon slowly descended over the Texas fields, tinting the sky with shades of amber and rust. Inside the house, time seemed different, suspended, almost still. Charlotte walked barefoot across the wooden floor, feeling the soft creak beneath her feet. With each room she passed through, she realized how much the house was more of a shelter for contained memories than a living home. The windows were always slightly open, as if light were an unwelcome intruder. The heavy, dark furniture seemed to have been arranged by someone who wanted to occupy space, but not truly inhabit it. Everything was functional but devoid of affection. There were paintings, yes, but all of them were cold. Horses, portraits of strangers, colorless landscapes. In the main hall, a piano covered by a white sheet caught her attention. She approached it, gently pulling the fabric away and running her fingers across the dusty keys. A note escaped, a soft, trembling sound. It echoed through the room like an old sigh. Charlotte smiled faintly, as if she had found a forgotten letter at the bottom of a drawer. It was the first living sound the space had made. She continued, exploring slowly. In a small cabinet near the stairs, she found a box filled with old books. Dusty, worn by time, but some still legible. Her fingers traced the titles with reverence. English classics, rural tales, melancholic poems. One of them, Jane Eyre, had a torn spine, and she instinctively embraced it, as if she had just reunited with a part of herself. She climbed to the second-floor library, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain. There she found more shelves, this time almost empty. The heavy curtains blocked the light, and the smell of old wood and loneliness filled the air. Charlotte opened the windows, even though she knew William wouldn't approve. She felt the warm breeze rush into the room and tousle her hair, as if the house were slowly waking up. Later in the bedroom, she sat on the worn sofa at the foot of the bed, holding the book in her hands. She wore only a simple white nightgown, her hair pulled up in a loose bun. She read aloud slowly, as she did on cold nights in the orphanage. It was her prayer, her ritual, her way of surviving. "I am not a bird, and no net can hold me. I am a free human being with an independent will." Outside, the cicadas sang, and hidden behind the slightly open door in the hallway, William listened. He didn't know why he had come upstairs. He told himself it was just curiosity. He wanted to know if she was bothered, if she was already thinking of leaving. But the truth was different. When her voice cut through the silence of the house like a thread of gold in the darkness, he stopped and listened. The softness, the intonation, the way she brought those words to life. It dismantled him from the inside. She had no idea she was being heard, and perhaps that's why it sounded so genuine, so different from anything he had ever known. William leaned his head against the wooden wall, eyes closed. Why did this woman affect him so much? Why did the image of her reading, her feet curled up on the sofa, seem more intimate than any touch? Charlotte, in turn, remained there, immersed in the pages, but something inside her was starting to realize that the silence of this house wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a request. The house breathed silence, but not the same silence as before. There was something new floating in the air, a subtle vibration, as if each wall began to register her presence. Charlotte had spent the day rearranging small details: a vase with dried flowers on the stairway console, curtains open in the living room, a lavender-scented cloth passing over the old furniture. Quietly, she was sewing life into the forgotten structure of the house, and that night, when the darkness settled over the fields like a thick veil, Charlotte returned to her ritual. She took a warm bath, tied her hair with a blue ribbon, and put on a simple white cotton nightgown with delicate lace at the bust. She wasn't thinking of seducing, at least not directly, but there was something in the way her gestures flowed, a natural sweetness, provoking without knowing. She sat on the same sofa as the night before, turned on the lamp and opened the book. Her soft voice filled the room. And so, even in the middle of the storm, she chose to stay. Not because it was easy, but because there was love. In the hallway, leaning against the wall like a man conflicted with his own body, William Carter listened. The sound of her voice seemed to pass through the wood, breaking down defenses he didn't even know were still there. His eyes closed, involuntarily, as her words vibrated in his ears, as if each syllable had the power to dissolve his oldest walls. He tried not to imagine the scene, but he failed. With each word read, the image of Charlotte took on a clear form. Sitting, her knees together, bare feet on the rug, the nightgown revealing the soft curve of her legs and the beginning of her collarbone. The warm glow of the lamp kissing her skin, and her eyes lowered, immersed in feelings that only the books could understand. William rubbed his face, irritated with himself. He was giving in. Worse, he was desiring. And it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that came from the way she looked at the house, how she treated the objects, how she held a cup with both hands, as if it were a treasure. Memories began to haunt him. His mother, who had once been like Charlotte, sweet, persistent, full of hope, and the day his father crushed all of that with harsh words and eternal silences. Since then, William had promised himself that he wouldn't need anyone, never again, but there she was, and he already needed her, even if he wouldn't admit it. At that moment, Charlotte slowly closed the book. She didn't know why, but she felt like she was being watched. Her heart skipped a silent beat, as if her senses recognized an invisible presence. She turned, her face toward the door, but no one was there. Still, she smiled, a shy, secret smile, as if her soul had heard something that her ears hadn't caught. Outside, William silently stepped away. His steps were slow, as if each inch separating him from her took an inhuman effort. He wanted to go back, he wanted to enter that room, sit next to her, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. The sun was still yawning on the horizon when Charlotte came down to the kitchen. The scent of fresh bread mixed with the light fragrance of lavender she had applied to her wrists. She wore a simple, light blue dress with gathered sleeves and a ribbon at the waist. Her hair was loosely tied in a casual bun, leaving the nape of her neck exposed. She had no idea the impact that image would have. William was already there, sitting as usual at the head of the table. But that day, his eyes followed her with more intensity than he had ever allowed. And it was at that moment, as she approached with a soft smile, that he felt it. The desire, the unease, the conflict. "Good morning, William," she said with that sweet, firm tone that was beginning to sound like music in his ears. He cleared his throat, trying to appear indifferent. "Good morning?" The silence between them this time was different. It wasn't discomfort. It was tension, the kind that sits between two people when there's something unsaid, untouched, but intensely present. Charlotte poured the coffee delicately, sitting right across from him. William's eyes lingered for a second on the bow at the waist of her dress, on the way her fingers stirred sugar into her cup. Small gestures, almost innocent, but to him they were torture. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, cutting a piece of bread. "Yes," he answered too quickly, looking away. Charlotte noticed the discomfort but didn't press. Instead, she just smiled and took a small bite of the warm bread, making a nearly involuntary which sounded more intimate than any words they had exchanged so far. William almost knocked over his cup. The kitchen was tidy, bathed in the soft morning light. The sun filtered through the open windows, revealing dust particles dancing in the air. The space, once cold and impersonal, now seemed like a home. And William hated to admit it, but this stirred something in him, in everything about him. Because what Charlotte was doing little by little was occupying spaces, first with silence, then with smiles, now with scents and rituals. And the most dangerous part, she wasn't trying anything. She just was. Charlotte looked at him sometimes as if she saw beyond the surface, as if she knew that beneath the stubble and the harsh way he spoke, there was a man, lonely, and that unsettled him. He tried to focus on the newspaper, but her voice still echoed in his mind. The reading from the previous night, the sound of pages turning, the curve of her neck when she leaned over to reread a passage. The desire grew, and with it, the fear. "I need to leave early today," he said, abruptly standing up. Charlotte looked up, surprised. "Already? It's not even 7. I have things to do in the field." He avoided looking her in the eyes. He grabbed his hat, the barn key, and walked toward the door with firm steps. Charlotte remained, seated, the coffee growing cold between her fingers. She sighed without bitterness. She knew how to recognize a fleeing heart. She had seen many, but she also knew what made it return. And outside, as William crossed the porch, her scent still clung to his shirt. He stopped for a moment, but he didn't go back. Not yet. The sound of running water filled the kitchen that late afternoon. Charlotte, with an apron tied at her waist and sleeves rolled up, washed the dishes with slow, almost hypnotic movements. Steam rose from the sink, enveloping the space in a warm, silent mist. From the old radio on the counter, an instrumental tune played softly, as if the house itself was beginning to learn how to sigh. Outside, William had just put the horses away in the barn. Sweaty, exhausted, his shirt partially open, and his boots covered in dust, he walked toward the kitchen without knowing why. Maybe hunger, maybe thirst, maybe the smell. But deep down, he knew. It was her. When he entered, he saw her from behind. Charlotte seemed to float, her loose hair held back by a ribbon, the curve of her neck visible, her arms wet with warm water. The orange light of the evening streamed through the window and kissed her skin with a tenderness that made him stop. Just watch. Charlotte, even with her back to him, felt it. The air shifted, the space behind her filled with presence, with heat. She turned slowly, holding a still wet dish in her hands, and there he was. The gaze fixed, intense, hungry, but contained. William didn't say anything. He just took 2 steps forward. Silence. The dish slipped slightly. She held it firmly, but her eyes, now locked on his, no longer knew where to land. William came closer, very close. Close enough that she could smell earth, sweat, and something uniquely him. He raised his hand almost unconsciously, and his fingers hovered over the strap of her apron, almost touching. Almost. Charlotte held her breath. Her heart raced. But then he saw his own reflection in the window beside them. 2 intense but confused eyes. A man torn between what he desires and what he fears. William stepped back as if he'd been pushed from within, lowered his hand, cleared his throat, and spoke in a hoarse tone. "Is the water hot?" Charlotte blinked, trying to catch her breath. "Yes, it is." He nodded, without looking directly at her, grabbed a glass from the shelf, and filled it. With cold water. He drank as if he wanted to extinguish the fire rising inside him. "Good night," he said, already turning his back, heading toward the door. Charlotte stayed still for a few seconds, her hands still wet. The dish now rested in the sink. She knew that in that moment he had fought a battle, and that she had almost won. The sun was already rising when William mounted his horse and rode out to the fields. The sky was clear, the air dry, the silence only broken by the sound of hooves against the packed earth. He needed distance, hard work, sweat. He needed to forget. Desire had been growing like a weed, uncontrollable. It wasn't just attraction. It was a kind of silent possession. And that made him furious. Not with her, with himself. "She's just a woman," he repeated inwardly, his fists clenched on the reins. "You've lived without anyone for years. You can keep going like this." But the memory of the previous night betrayed him. The image of her reading, the nightgown clinging to her body from the breeze, the curve of her neck lit by the lamp's glow, her soft voice narrating stories of forbidden loves. It was unbearable to forget, and completely impossible to resist. Out in the fields, everything seemed indifferent to the storm he was living through inside. The cattle mooed in the distance, the horses grazed in silence. William crouched to fix the fence at the corral, trying to focus on the work. The air was heavy, and sweat dripped down his neck, mixing with the dust. Each hammer strike on the tee nail was an attempt to silence his heart, but it didn't help. Her scent, lavender with a sweet hint of vanilla, still clung to his shirt, even after the bath from the night before, even after scrubbing his hands with soap in the barn's sink. He suddenly stood up, throwing the hammer aside. He needed to breathe. He climbed to the highest point of the property, where the wind was stronger. He took off his hat, ran his hands through his damp hair, and stood there, motionless, trying to understand why a woman he barely knew could destabilize him so much. The answer was within him, because Charlotte wasn't just living in his house now. She was starting to live in his memories, and that was dangerous. William returned home at sunset, his shoulders heavier than when he had left, his face marked by the sun and by doubt. He entered through the back door silently and saw the clean-lit hallway. On the table, a small crocheted tablecloth that hadn't been there before. In the corner, a bouquet of freshly picked lavender. He smelled it before he even realized she was there. And she was. Charlotte, with her back to him, folding some clothes in the living room, a light white dress, her bare feet on the rug. She turned slowly as if she felt his breath in the air. Their eyes met, no words. Just that look that said everything neither of them dared to confess. William looked away and hurried up the stairs. He entered the room, threw his hat on the bed, and went straight to the bathroom. He turned on the cold water. He took off his shirt as if it burned, and stepped under the icy stream. But not even the water could extinguish what had been burning for days and now it consumed every part of him. The following days arrived wrapped in a strange calmness. William continued leaving early and returning late, as if the fields were the only place where he could breathe. But behind that escape, there was something undeniable. The house was no longer the same. Charlotte moved through the rooms as if she understood the soul of a place before it even spoke. She didn't try to change everything at once. She knew men like William didn't respond well to sudden changes. Instead, she left gentle marks, almost invisible, but felt. In the living room, she took down the heavy curtains and replaced them with lighter fabrics that danced in the wind and let the light in. She placed small floral cushions on the sofa. She organized the books on the shelf by genre, as she used to do at the orphanage. In the center of the table, a vase with fresh lavender branches filled the air with perfume that drifted upstairs. In the kitchen, she began preparing breakfast more carefully. Homemade bread with honey, fruits, cut into small ceramic bowls, butter whipped with herbs, not out of obligation, but because cooking to her was a way of saying "I see you," even when the other person didn't know how to respond. One morning, William walked in and noticed everything. The aroma, the table, the hand-embroidered dish towel with the word "home" sewn in the corner. But he said nothing. He sat down, ate in silence, and left. Charlotte just watched. She already knew that in men like him, silence was sometimes more revealing than 1,000 words. In the bedroom, she opened the windows that had been closed for years. She let the wind in. The sheets were replaced with white cotton ones with lace edges. In the corner, a small stool with a stack of books. On the nightstand, a scented candle. It was as if each object was saying, "Someone lives here now." And even though William didn't say anything, she knew he noticed. The way he ran his fingers absent-mindedly over the clean table. How he glanced at the books he had once ignored. How one night he stopped in front of the lit living room and just watched. Charlotte also felt. She felt that something was changing. That each flower placed in a vase was, in fact, an attempt to reach his heart from the inside, without intruding, without demanding, just remaining. And perhaps the most transformative gesture was the simplest. On a cloudy afternoon, she placed a rocking chair on the porch. Beside it, a folded blanket, a steaming cup of tea, and a small handwritten note. Sometimes all we need is a place to sit and feel. She wasn't home at that moment. She had gone to the barn to bring a basket of bread to the caretaker. But when William climbed onto the porch and saw that, he stopped. He read the note, sat down, stayed there. 20 minutes, no hurry, no defenses, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just exist. The day had been long. William returned earlier than usual from the fields, the rain threatening to fall, and the air carried the scent of wet earth that awakened old memories. He entered through the side door, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and went straight to the small room next to the laundry where he usually left his work clothes. He needed a bath, urgently. The heat of his own body bothered him, but not as much as the confusion inside him. That's when he saw it. On the wooden bench, carefully folded, was the white cotton dress Charlotte wore on warmer afternoons. Simple, with hand-embroidered details, and a fabric belt tied in a bow. He recognized it instantly. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment William froze. There was something deeply intimate about that piece of clothing, as if she had left not just the fabric, but a part of herself. He looked around. The house was silent. She was probably upstairs, or maybe in the garden, picking lavender like she sometimes did. Without thinking, he reached out. He touched the dress. The cotton was soft, still warm. Her scent rose, flooding his space like a silent avalanche. Lavender, clean skin, sweetness. William closed his eyes and brought the fabric to his face. He breathed deeply. God! What was she doing to him? The desire, which had been contained for days, spread like fire. It wasn't just physical, it was something more. The way she smiled at him even when he didn't respond. The way she arranged the books. How she spoke to the flowers. How she sang softly while doing the dishes. She was light, and he, a man who had spent so much time in the shadows that he no longer knew how to react to such brightness. He squeezed the dress between his fingers, as if that could calm the storm raging inside him, but it was useless. He needed to control himself. He set the fabric aside and quickly walked to the bathroom. He pulled off his shirt haphazardly, tossing it on the floor, and turned the shower on full blast. Cold water, sharp drops. But even that couldn't extinguish the fire. Leaning against the wall, eyes closed, breathing heavily, William tried to remember who he was before her. When silence was enough. When he felt nothing. But now he felt. More and more. And closer to losing control. The night fell slowly, as if the sky hesitated to erase the last trace of light. Inside the house, Charlotte finished preparing dinner with smooth, almost ritualistic movements. Her skilled hands seasoned the chicken with herbs, while the rice steamed in the cast-iron pot. The scent of rosemary and golden garlic filled the air, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Almost dangerous. She quickly went upstairs, changed out of her soiled dress into a discreet beige one with floral details at the cuffs. She tied her hair into a loose bun, letting 2 strands fall naturally across her face. Nothing about her screamed intention, and yet everything about her called out. William descended the stairs and paused at the last step. She was facing away from him, placing the dish on the table. The smell, the sound of the cloth sliding over the wood, the whisper of her clothes against her body. Every detail seemed meticulously calculated, even though he knew it wasn't. It was worse, it was natural. He sat at the table, his breathing more shallow than usual. Charlotte turned around, a slight smile on her lips, and served a scoop of rice onto his plate. "I hope you're hungry." "I am," he replied softly, almost hoarsely. Dinner began in silence. Only the sound of silverware against plates, and the 2 bodies occupying spaces millimeters apart, yet at the same time charged with electricity. William tried to eat, tried to look anywhere but the subtle neckline of her dress or the way. Her mouth moved while chewing, but the worst was the smell. The same fragrance that had clung to the dress in the laundry now danced in the air around him. Lavender, honey, and desire. Charlotte didn't say anything, but her eyes rested on him with an unsettling sweetness, as if she already knew the chaos she was causing, and still chose to remain silent. "Is the food good?" she asked, breaking the tense air with a light voice. "It's great," he said without lifting his eyes. "Like everything you do." It was quick, involuntary, but she heard it and blushed. William noticed the blush on her cheeks and cursed himself silently. He grabbed the water glass, drank it like it was alcohol. She was driving him crazy, and she had no idea, or did she? When Charlotte got up to fetch an extra dish, she passed behind him. A light movement, a minimal distance, but enough for their arms to almost touch. He held his breath. He could feel the heat of her skin even without contact, and in that moment, all he wanted was to turn around, pull her close, and give in. But he didn't. He stood up, pushed his chair back slowly, and let out a muffled sigh. "I need to step outside, get some air." Charlotte looked at him, confused, still holding the dish towel in her hand. "Did something happen?" "No," he lied. "Just need to clear my head." He left, closed the door behind him carefully, as if any sound could break what was being built inside. And outside, in the darkness of the porch, William looked up at the starry sky, his chest heaving. There was no wind, but inside him a storm. The house slept in silence, but not everyone inside could manage it. The wall clock marked almost 10 o'clock at night when Charlotte lit the lamp in the living room and settled into her usual spot, on the sofa, as if seeking refuge in a ritual already sacred. The book, resting on her lap, was an old friend, a classic romance with yellowed pages and a scent of the past that she loved so much. She was exhausted, but her soul craved words, stories. It was in them that she found peace. And lately, it was in them that she felt someone was listening to her. Even if that someone never spoke a word, she wore a light cotton nightgown, pale blue, with lace details at the sleeves. Her hair was loose, falling in waves over her shoulders, still damp from her recent bath. Her feet, curled under her body, were bare on the fluffy rug. She opened the book with a sigh and began reading softly aloud. He didn't know the name of that feeling, but he knew that every time she entered the room, the world stopped, and silence became a necessity. At the top of the stairs, William Carter stopped. He had just returned from the town. The meeting with the supplier had dragged on, and he was still wearing his dark coat, his hair disheveled from the rush. But as soon as he pushed open the front door and heard that voice coming from the living room, everything around him lost importance. He descended the stairs silently, his eyes fixed on the image before him. Charlotte. Sitting there, bathed in the soft light of the lamp, she seemed more a character than a reader. The nightgown gently outlined her curves, but it was her expression, serene, surrendered, completely unaware of the impact she had, that made his heart beat faster. She continued, reading, unaware she was being watched. He wanted to touch her, not impulsively, but as one touches something sacred, with open hands and exposed heart, the fear of rejection in the gaze. William stood there, frozen, as if her voice had bound him with invisible threads. With each word she read, it felt as if she was unraveling his thoughts, as if each passage spoke directly to him. And then, in a light gesture, she pulled her hair to the side, exposing the bare curve of her neck. It was too much. He took one step, then another. Charlotte finally saw him. She lifted her eyes from the book and met his gaze. Silence. He began, but his voice failed him. She slowly closed the book as if understanding what was left unsaid. The air between them was dense, vibrating. He was close. Close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, the sweet scent of lavender, the quickened sound of her restrained breath. For a moment, the world stopped. And then, William reached out and touched the back of the sofa, as if needing support to keep from losing himself completely. But he didn't touch her. Not yet. Time seemed to hold its breath when William's eyes met Charlotte's. The room, once silent, now vibrated with an invisible but pulsating tension. There was an entire universe compressed between two souls, and in that moment, everything that had been contained began to crumble. William moved closer, slowly, as if each step toward her was a definitive choice. Charlotte remained seated, but her chest rose and fell more quickly. Her fingers gripped the closed book tightly, not out of fear, but anticipation. A gentle heat spread over her skin, the kind of shiver that precedes a storm. He stopped in front of her. His eyes, always so cold, now burned, but not with anger, not with pride. It was desire, confused, uncontrollable, real. "You drive me crazy," he said hoarsely, almost a whisper. Charlotte parted her lips, but no words came. Only her gaze responded, a gaze that said, "Then stop running." And he stopped. William's hand touched her face, as if asking for permission. A slow touch, his fingers grazing her cheek and trailing down to her hair. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the shiver that came with the gesture. His skin was warm, slightly rough. The emotions, however, were soft, almost reverent. When their lips met, it wasn't urgent, it was slow, painfully tender, like two worlds colliding slowly, discovering the cracks, the fits, the gaps. A deep kiss, full of unspoken meanings, and yet more real than any confession. William pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist firmly, as if afraid she might disappear. Charlotte surrendered without fear, like someone who had waited for this moment her whole life, even without knowing it. Between kisses and interrupted breaths, he lifted her with ease and climbed the stairs, as if he knew exactly where to go, his eyes never leaving hers. At the door to the bedroom, he hesitated. She touched his face with the tips of her fingers. "I want to," she whispered, and the last barrier fell. The room filled with yellowed light, soft shadows dancing on the walls. Their bodies discovered each other in silence, with hands exploring paths and looks saying more than words. Charlotte was warmth, surrender, living poetry. William was urgency, care, redemption. The nightgown fell slowly. The layers of pride, pain, and loneliness fell with it. He kissed her shoulders, her collarbones, the invisible scars that time had left on her, and she responded with touches that said, I see who you are, and I don't run from it." They made love as if they had found home. There were no promises that night, only the certainty that after this moment nothing would ever be the same, and when their bodies quieted, intertwined in the still messy sheets, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a new silence, of belonging, of peace. The early morning bid farewell in soft hues as the first rays of sunlight touched the windows of the Carter farm. The light entered slowly, gently, as if it knew something sacred had happened inside. In the still messy sheets, William and Charlotte's bodies lay side by side, wrapped in a new comfortable silence. His breathing, once always heavy, was now calm, and she smiled without opening her eyes. The room exhaled a mix of lavender, warmth, and something harder to name, something like belonging. William woke first. He turned slowly, propping his elbow on the pillow, and he simply watched her. Charlotte slept with a lightness that disarmed him. Her hair spread across the pillow, one hand outstretched, as if she were reaching for something even. In her dreams, the curve of her slightly parted lips, her skin flushed from the warmth of the sheet, she was beautiful. But more than that, she was real. He had never allowed himself to see a woman like this, without armor, without games, the naked truth in all its vulnerability, and it was there, in that moment, that William understood. It wasn't just desire. It wasn't just affection. It was love. Scary, yes, but inevitable. Charlotte opened her eyes slowly, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She met his grey eyes, and unlike before, there was a new tenderness in them, almost shy. "You're looking at me like you've discovered a secret," she said, her voice hoarse with sleep. "I have," he replied without smiling, but with a warm look. She moved closer, her fingers gliding softly across his arm. "And are you going to tell me?" William sighed. "I don't know when it happened." Charlotte stared at him, not looking away. "When what?" He reached his hand to her face, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. "When I fell in love with you." She held her breath for a moment. Her eyes shone. But she didn't respond. Right away. She wanted to feel those words echo in her skin, in her chest, in her whole soul. William continued. "I fought it. I swear I fought it. I know. But I can't anymore." He smiled finally. A small, sincere, slightly crooked smile, as if he were still learning how to be light. "I want you, Charlotte, completely." "And your fear?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It's still here, but now there's you on the other side. And that changes everything." Charlotte slid her hand to his face and kissed him tenderly. "I want it too, a family. A house that smells like coffee and lavender, a love that doesn't need to hide." They embraced, and for a few seconds, the world outside disappeared. All that mattered was there, in that room, in that morning, in that love, which finally had a name. The days that followed carried a new lightness, as if the very land of the farm recognized the change that had taken place within that house. The sky seemed bluer, the winds gentler, and William Carter. He was no longer the same man, not that he had changed all of a sudden. His habits were still the same. He woke up early, rode through the fields, checked the fences, supervised the animals. But his gaze now rested upon things with a calm that didn't exist before, and there were also the small gestures. He left notes on the breakfast table. He took care of Charlotte's horse before her rides. He ran his hand through her hair absent-mindedly while she read at the foot of the bed. And sometimes, in the quieter moments, he would press his forehead to hers and simply breathe. Charlotte, in turn, was blooming. She no longer just transformed the house, but also the surroundings. She planted flowers in the front garden, painted the pots, invited the workers for simple dinners on the porch, and William would sit there next to her, his arm around the back of her chair with a half-smile on his lips, as if to say, "This is the home I didn't know I needed." They began to build what Charlotte had always dreamed of, a life made of affection, presence, and consistency. And there was no need for grand daily declarations. Love manifested in the unspoken, in a glance across the kitchen, in a lingering kiss before bed, in a hand deliberately placed over the other. One afternoon, while they were cleaning out the old barn for a small celebration with the farm workers, Charlotte stumbled over a loose piece of wood. William, quick as ever, caught her by the waist. Their eyes met. They laughed. "You've been a bit careless lately," he teased with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Or maybe it's you distracting me too much," she replied, blushing. William slowly pulled her closer. "I thought I wasn't capable of this." "Of what?" "Of loving someone like this." "Like what?" "With everything. With the past, with the quirks, with the fears, with my whole soul." Charlotte didn't answer. She simply rested her head on his chest and listened to the heart that for so long had lived behind walls, now beating free. And for her. Later, that same night, they walked hand in hand down the dirt path behind the house. The sky was full of stars and the breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the fields. William stopped halfway. He looked at her. "I want to grow old by your side," Charlotte smiled, her eyes misty. "Then let's plant love every day and harvest it together." They embraced for a long time, as if they knew that what they were building now was not just a romance. It was the rebirth of true love, the kind that doesn't come with empty promises, but with the daily decision to stay. The night arrived calmly, spilling its bluish darkness over the farm like a mantle of peace. The wind blew slowly, carrying the scent of the freshly watered garden flowers. Inside, the house was quiet, but not empty. There was warmth in the corners, soft laughter in the hallways, and something else, something only those who love in silence recognize: the waiting. William was finishing up some paperwork in the office when he heard her voice. Soft, melodic, hypnotic. He climbed the stairs without hurry, guided by the sound as if following a melody he knew by heart. When he reached the bedroom, he stopped at the door. Charlotte was sitting at the center of the bed, the lamp casting golden light over her bare shoulders. She wore a cream satin nightgown that slid over her skin like a second layer. Her hair, loose and slightly wavy, fell naturally down her back. In a provocative way, she held an open book and read aloud. And when he looked at her, he realized that all the lost time had been worth it. If the destiny was to end up here on this night, in this body, in this love. William smiled lightly, leaning against the doorframe, watching her without being noticed for a few seconds. Each of her movements was a dance, the way she turned, the pages, the way she wet her lips with the tip of her tongue before reading the next paragraph, the way she moved her ankle under the sheets, a restlessness almost childlike. And all of it was his. "Are you seducing me on purpose?" he asked, his voice hoarse, heavy with desire. Charlotte slowly closed the book, never taking her eyes off him. "What if I am?" William moved closer, slowly, like a predator about to surrender. "Then you're doing it very well." He sat beside her and slid his fingers down her bare arm, feeling her skin shiver under his touch. Charlotte smiled, her gaze steady but sweet. "I learned from you that I don't need to shout to be heard." He pulled her gently toward him, pressing their bodies together with care, with reverence. "And I learned from you that a home is where love lives." They kissed as if it were the first time, or the last, or both at the same time. Their hands explored each other slowly. Their bodies recognized each other again. But now, without fear, without walls, without doubt, it was reconnection. It was certainty. It was love that withstands time, loneliness, distrust, and is reborn even stronger in the gentleness of an ordinary night. Hours later, with their bodies intertwined and their breaths synchronized, Charlotte broke the silence. "Can I read one more chapter?" William pulled her closer, her head on his chest. "Only if you promise to love me like the character does," she smiled, her eyes slowly closing. "I don't need to pretend to be any character for that, William." "Why?" "Because I already love you, like no one ever has." And so that peaceful early morning, amidst kisses, turned pages, and whispered promises, they loved each other again, as husband and wife, as lovers, as two hearts that, at last, found each other in the same rhythm. How many times have you hidden your affection just because you thought the other person wouldn't know what to do with it? How many times have you stayed silent, even when your heart was overflowing? And what if true love isn't about who arrives shouting, but about who stays even when everything is still silence? William and Charlotte show us that sometimes love doesn't need promises at the beginning. It needs presence, patience, eyes that see even when the mouth doesn't speak. Now tell me, have you ever loved someone who had their heart closed, off too much to let you in? Or have you been that person who needed to learn to love when someone gentle insisted on staying? Comment here where you're listening to this story from, and if at any moment you felt like this story was yours too. And if this touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone special. Because sometimes, a story like this is all someone else needed to hear to not give up on love.